So at this time, I'm going to invite Tina Kilbourne to give us a presentation on the MAILT, the Muskoka Area Indigenous Leadership Table, which will be followed by a panel discussion. And after that, we're going to try to fit in some Q&A. Some of you have submitted questions ahead of time, and we'll try to address those. But if questions come up, if you think of something you'd like to ask during the webinar, please throw it in the Q&A, and we'll see if we can get to them. But we are trying to keep this a tight hour. Now, Tina Kilbourne's municipal career spans more than 20 years. Since 2011, she has been with the District Municipality of Muskoka. Most of her time has been in community services, working on programs to support vulnerable children and families. She is most recently the team lead of the Continuous Improvement Unit, where one of her main roles has been developing the district's Indigenous relationship strategy. And Tina is actually also a noted author. So welcome very much. Welcome, Tina. And I'll hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me today. I am incredibly pleased to be here, partly because I'm proud of the work that we have accomplished with the Muskoka Area Indigenous Leadership Table, and also just because I think it's important to encourage others to go down this path. And just from in terms of a personal endorsement, I'd have to say that this has been probably the most rewarding work I've had the honor of doing in my fairly long career, and I know other people feel the same way. So I will share my screen and get started on my presentation. Just a sec, I'm sharing my screen. There we go. Can everybody see that presentation okay? Okay, I'll assume that's a yes. So I have a few slides today. Basically, I wanted to just note that the Muskoka Area Indigenous Leadership Table, sometimes people pronounce it MAILT, I pronounce it MAILT, either one works. It was created to help with overall Indigenous municipal relations. Land use planning is one aspect, but not the original focus. But still, there's been definitely some relevant successes that I think will be of interest to this group. The membership includes the District of Muskoka, which is the upper tier municipality. There are 6 area municipalities. Those are the lower tiers. We have 6 Indigenous nations that have actively participated over the past 2 to 3 years, but there has been some flux. We have various representatives, but good participation from chiefs, senior administrators. We have the district chair, we have mayors, we have CAOs and other senior staff. And then the district provides a dedicated admin coordination support, which is me. And I just want to say off the top, this has been a very organic process to date. This hasn't been, there's been no official MOU or memorandum of understanding, but there has been some work done on a friendship accord. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So today, basically, I want to give a little bit of context, talk about the district's history of engagement and the catalyst and approach for establishing the MAILT. I'm going to run over some key success factors and best practices, as well as challenges, accomplishments, success stories, and some next steps. Sorry, I'm driving, so I have to click both things. Okay, so in terms of context, we have in 2001, the district undertook a visioning exercise as part of the official plan review process, and it was called Muskoka Moving Forward. And at that time, we contracted Archaeological Services, Inc. to lead the engagement with First Nations communities. And through extensive research, ASI determined that 8 First Nations had a traditional tie or ongoing interest in the lands that now encompass Muskoka and should be included in the consultation process. So those are listed here. We have the Mwata Mohawks, Moose Deer Point First Nation, Bosley Island First Nation, Chippewas of Mnjikaning Rama First Nation, Wissahickon First Nation, the Huron-Wendat First Nation, Georgian Island First Nation, and the Métis Nation of Ontario, which locally is the Moon River Métis Council. And just to put that into a little bit of context, geographically, because you can see it's a fairly complex system in terms of engagement. The part outlined in red and highlighted in a slightly different color is the District of Muskoka. And you can see that we have Wasauksing First Nation, which is located up here near Perry Sound, Moose Deer Point, and we have Colette Isaac on the line for Moose Deer Point, are located over here on the coast. Wata Mohawks, there you may not be able to see it, but there is a lighter square here, and that is Wata Mohawks. The Beausoleil First Nation is over here. Georgiana Island is down here in Lake Simcoe, if you didn't know, and then Chippewas of Mnjikaning or Rama First Nation, and we have Chief Williams on the webinar today, is located down here. So we also have the Moon River Métis Council, which is, their offices are located in Gravenhurst, but of course they span the entire region. And then interestingly, we have the Huron-Wendat Nation, which is located in Quebec City. They are sort of an enclave called Wendake. And I have to say that because of our Zoom engagement, over the last couple of years, we've had been able to engage with that community in a way that we hadn't been able to before. So the history of engagement for the District of Muskoka didn't just start out of nowhere with the Muskoka Area Indigenous Leadership Table. In 1994, we developed one of the first archaeological master plans. In the late 1900s, with Colette's support, there was a notification protocol with Moose Deer Point First Nations and other municipal and provincial signatories, and it was re-ratified as recently as 2009. Of course, in 2011, we had the official plan review that I spoke about. And then in 2018, staff started to do background work to better understand how to strengthen relations with Indigenous nations. And in 2019, we established the Muskoka Area Indigenous Leadership Table and working groups. In terms of a catalyst for the sort of what started the whole thing and our approach, I think it's interesting. In 2018, staff were asked to update the O'Donnell Point notification protocol because it hadn't been ratified since 2009. And being part of the group that was working on that and having very little information about what it was and what it should be, I started to do some research. So I looked up other consultation and notification protocols. I had looked at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Stronger Together Toolkit. Of course, I looked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. I consulted with some industries that I had connections with just through families and friends that had, a heavy Indigenous engagement proponent to it. For instance, the mining industry. I got a lot of really good information there about how to engage. And in fact, that's where the idea to start the leadership table first took root. I also personally did the University of Alberta Indigenous Canada massive online course. And I just started to do a lot of reading by Indigenous authors and on Indigenous issues and looking at things in the news and the media, current events and things like that. From there, we developed a multi-point strategy for strengthening Indigenous municipal relations and presented it to our district chair and our CAO. And really, that's where everything started, because we had really good buy-in from the very beginning. And I will cite that as a key success factor. We wouldn't have gotten anywhere if there wasn't the organizational support and resources that were provided. So what we did for our approach, we drafted a formal letter of invitation. It went from the chiefs from the district chair to the chiefs of the 8 Indigenous nations, or the president for the in terms of the Métis Nation. We also had a similar letter that went to senior administrators from the district CAO, just to make sure we were connecting the dots at both levels. And in the letter, we outlined our proposed steps for strengthening Indigenous municipal relations. And then we worked together to set a meeting time and date that worked. The district basically managed the logistics in terms of setting the agenda and taking minutes and things like that. And if it hadn't been for Colette, who responded to one of these letters and reached out to me from Moose Deer Point First Nation and offered to host, I don't know how things would have gone. So that was definitely a key success factor too. And at the very first meeting, we had the district chair and the chief of Moose Deer Point co-chair the meeting. And it was, I was pretty nervous leading up into that, just because I didn't know what to expect and how everything was going to go. But it was fabulous. It went really well. Chief Williams' participation was pretty key early on. And so that's sort of where we were from there. From the very outset, the district committed to work with Indigenous nations on other things. Staff were pretty adamant that we don't just invite Indigenous nations to the table and try to pull information out of them, but we have to offer something in return. So what we offered to do was establish the leadership table. We committed to developing a formal land acknowledgement. We committed to providing Indigenous awareness training to all district staff, which is around 650 staff. And at that first meeting, we also had the suggestion, I think from Chief Williams, that we should also be educating our elected officials as well. So we did do that. We also promised to raise the public's understanding of Indigenous history, contribution, and culture within Muskoka. To develop Indigenous engagement principles for our municipality, and that the lower tier municipalities could also adopt. And then one of our other final commitments was to broaden and revise the O'Donnell Point consultation protocol, because that's where it all started. In terms of key success factors and best practices, like I mentioned, political will was pretty key right from the outset. And having organizational support and a long-term commitment for my time mainly, and to the funding that was required as I asked it. Up until 2022, we didn't have a dedicated line in our budget, but we do now. It's small, but there's always a chance to grow now that I've got the narrow edge in there. I think the other really key thing was having a dedicated project lead. Just because it's somebody to keep things moving. And I think what was important when I look back on it was having a passion for the work. But other important things was the comfort with uncertainty, because I've said many times, my analogy for this work has been like walking through a dark room with a blindfold on, and I don't really know where I'm going or where we're going as a group from one day to the next. So I'm sort of reaching from one piece of furniture to the next piece of furniture. So it's certainly taking some patience and humility and respect. It's really focused on relationship building skills, which is, I hadn't realized at the beginning, but Chief Williams certainly made that clear, and I see the wisdom of his guidance at that. Definitely listening skills and advocacy skills, because when I went back to the organization and said, okay, we need to do Indigenous awareness training, that's a big ask, a lot of staff and a lot of time. But I also cite education as one of the key success factors. And I didn't see the wisdom of it at the time, but I certainly do now, because as the program or the initiative has moved forward, we have counselors that have an understanding of the issues and the challenges and the barriers and what we're trying to do. And we also have staff. So we were able to sort of prepare the soil or build the foundational knowledge within the organization. And it's been so gratifying, because now staff are coming to me to say, how can we, focus more on Indigenous awareness and training. I had somebody contact me today from our Children's Services department. They're hosting a conference at the end of the year for all the early childhood educators, and they wanted to know how to incorporate some Indigenous awareness training and presence and knowledge and all sorts of wisdom into their program. So that's been really gratifying. I think that it was also important to demonstrate commitment to build the relationships. And remembering that the history of working with the settler population has not been a positive experience. I was very grateful for the Indigenous folks that came to our original meeting. I mean, I felt like I could see a little bit of weariness, like, okay, here we go again, we'll give them one more try. And I kudos for giving us a chance. I think it was important to be clear in the initial outreach that there's something in it for, it's not just about the settler population, that there's something in it for Indigenous nations too. And there was a mantra we adopted in one of our working groups early on. It was our land acknowledgement working group that, you know more, you do better, because we didn't get everything right off the bat. And I'm very grateful to the Indigenous members that sort of extended goodwill when we did make mistakes, and didn't take it personally, and sort of approached our blunders with good humor. Another foundational thing, and I'll give you information later about how you can find it, but we took very detailed minutes of our initial meetings, and I still do, because I thought they were foundational conversations. And if people, as leaders change or as membership changes, there's the opportunity for people to go back and see how the conversations actually took place. Yeah, and I think those, to me, are the key success factors and best practices, and the panel members later may have some others, but for me, that was key. In terms of challenges, there were a few. There were definitely cultural differences. When I first started, I was very focused on agenda items and response times and things like that. And I learned to slow down and focus on relationship building. And if I didn't get everything ticked off of my to-do list, it was okay. There's definitely cultural differences in the pace and the response time that took me a little bit to get used to. Being a settler, if there's a gap in the conversation, I start to panic and feel sweaty and want to fill it. But I have learned to embrace the periods of silence. I've had to look at my own personal bias and confront it, and my own white privilege and confront it. And I actually, I welcome that. I think that that's been one of the best aspects of this whole journey for me. I had to really embrace personally feeling unprepared and uninformed and uneducated. So that was a challenge. I'm feeling more comfortable now. And there was definitely a challenge with buy-in. I started we started off inviting people, but sometimes, some of the elected officials would send an alternate, or a staff member, or a CIO would send a director or something like that. But I'm happy to say we have really good commitment now from the higher levels. And I think that when I send out the doodle poll, I get responses right away. And when I send out the meeting invite, I can see the meeting acceptances coming in. So I know people are very keen. Capacity is a big issue for Indigenous and municipal members. It took us a long time and some outreach from the different Indigenous members just to hear what their day-to-day life is like, trying to track all the municipal and other notices and notices of consultation and notifications and things like that. And also we had capacity issues at the district, especially as COVID has hit. We had probably an 8 or 9 month hiatus in there where we didn't meet when COVID first hit, and we tried to figure out what we were doing and how we were going to do it. I think that the last thing is just the complexity of working with sovereign nations as municipalities. So, Indigenous nations working with all levels of government without a specific mandate to work with municipalities, and the complexity of it, different timelines and frameworks and priorities and jurisdictional reporting has certainly made it challenging. But if you go back to the fact that you're focusing on building relationships, it's all okay in the end. So just to share some accomplishments and successes that I am quite proud of, and I know others are too. This is the 3rd year that the Indigenous Leadership Table. So June will be our 3rd year anniversary. Yeah, that will be our 3rd year anniversary that we've been operating, and we'll be heading into our 4th year. I feel like the Indigenous awareness training was a huge accomplishment. Because of COVID, we didn't get everybody. We did have about 530 district staff, elected officials, participate. We offered 2 different kinds of training. And now we are offering Indigenous awareness training to the community at large, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We did create through a working group a land acknowledgement guidelines and framework document. And now we have all of our upper tier and our lower tier councils are offering land acknowledgement statements at the beginning of all their council meetings. Some were already doing it, but now we have everybody doing it. We also have that guidelines and framework that are available for other organizations, and we've had quite a lot of requests so that it walks people through so that people can create their own meaningful land acknowledgement statement. And it just sort of is a little bit of an education journey, a short one, but it's one that's interesting and important nonetheless. We've drafted some engagement principles and are moving towards a friendship accord. We did do a mass public statement around the mass and unmarked graves when the Kamloops residential school was first discovered, and that was a really important moment, I think, in the relationship building, and was very well received. We also had council adopt a motion regarding September 30th as being the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and are planning to do a more fulsome response in 2022. Some of our lower tier municipalities had some great programs and some great events and celebrations. So I don't know if celebration is the right word, but you know what I mean. And that has also really helped build relationships among Indigenous and non-Indigenous throughout the district. And I guess really the key accomplishment is a stronger relationships, not just at the leader to leader level, but now at the staff to, you know, staff level, which is really starting to take off at this point. And just probably a little bit on success stories. There was quite a lot of it, but I think for me, one of the most important things is the momentum that we're gaining in the municipal sector. The level of awareness on additional Indigenous issues is very heartening for me. We've had Lake of Bays, and Mayor Glover is here, and he may be able to speak to this, renamed Colonization Road. They had I think it was a private road in Lake of Bays that was called Colonization Road. And at our very first Muskoka Indigenous leadership table, the Moon River Métis members stood up and said that they were looking to rename roads. So that happened very quickly. There was the drinking water intake that was captured on the official plan for Moose Deer Point, and new planning processes around that. We have a facility in Gravenhurst called the Muskoka Steamship and Discovery Center, and it's like a little museum, and they have been working the last couple of years to put on a new addition. It's about 3,000 square feet, and because of the work that was happening at the Indigenous leadership table, they made the decision to dedicate that 3,000 square foot exhibit to Indigenous stories being told by local Indigenous people and nations, and have pulled together a working group, and district council approved some funding that went towards that, $175,000. So that was really excellent. We had a rural transportation bus route that was working with WATA to make sure that the bus could travel through their community. It hasn't been able to make stops because of COVID, but just being able to do that consultation was really important, and it was so much easier. There's some other things there that, you know, the OPP detachment boards, municipalities were deep into that last year at looking at creating OPP detachment boards that would have Indigenous and municipal members on that. So the engagement for that became a lot easier. Like I mentioned before, we've been able to connect early on staff. That's the early childhood educators, staff and programs. There's been success with having our GIS function do some 911 addresses, helping Moose Deer Point with that, as well as some other GIS functions. We've been able to help work with WATA on some floodplain mapping, moving garbage bin sites, which is a big deal up here because of our seasonal residents. Colette could speak more to that. We have some very informal quarterly conversations that happen with our Engineering and Public Works Department and the WATA and the Moose Deer Point First Nations, just about roads and solid waste and things like that. And at our very last duty to consult working group meeting, we had our Engineering and Public Works Department do a presentation about their long range planning for capital projects and everything that impacted and some things that didn't impact Indigenous nations. And this was a really good first step, I think, towards sort of giving, lots of notification and involving everybody in the planning process, not just sending a letter off at the very last minute. So kudos to our Commissioner of Engineering and Public Works for initiating that process. So in terms of next steps, we did in July introduce sort of what we call strengthening Indigenous relations strategy 2.0. And that includes more Indigenous awareness education for the new councillors when the new council comes in 2023. And then what's even more exciting is perhaps that we have launched community Indigenous awareness training. It'll take place in April, May, and June, and it's open to partner agencies, nonprofits, associations, and even residents. We have about 400 seats. And the initial sort of email campaign has gone out, and the uptake's been really strong. And so we are looking forward to that. We also noticed that the Indigenous Leadership Table is very focused on Indigenous nations, but we were missing the urban and off-reserve Indigenous voice. So we've created a sort of secondary system and now have some urban Indigenous residents that have attended the first MAILT meeting and will continue to do so. We're, like other jurisdictions, looking at road and a place name changing. We're starting on a pilot project. Muskoka Road 38 runs right through Wata Mohawks First Nation, and it's called Muskoka Road 38. So as a pilot project, we're going to look at renaming that road and using what we learned from that to broaden that, to look at the roads and place names at other areas in Muskoka and decide what else we should consider renaming, and consulting with Indigenous Nations to come up with new names for that. And this will be new information to everybody on the panel, but we also have an archaeological mapping study that's coming up, and it should have been part of the plan, but we didn't have it in, sort of on the radar, but there is money in the budget, and the study will delineate areas of significance across Muskoka in terms of historical Indigenous travel routes and settlements. So I'm really looking forward to that project kicking off. So as I said, there is a place to find more information. We have a project page on a platform called Engage. It's Engage Muskoka, and there is a link to it. All of the links there to all of the reports that have gone to council about the MAILT, all the meeting minutes from the MAILT, and the working groups, which are two, the Duty to Consult Working Group and the Land Acknowledgement Working Group, as well as some other resources, and just a summary of everything that's going on. So that's kind of it for me. I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm sorry if I spoke too quickly, but I wanted to get it all in.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tina. That was a lot of great information in a short period of time. So I'll encourage everyone to go check out that website. We shared it in the chat. And hopefully we might be able to dive a little more into some of those examples that Tina mentioned in the panel chat, or the panel discussion. Now, I'm just going to mention this. We were going to introduce each panelist, but to save on time and to make more room for discussion, I think we'll probably just put their bios in the chat so you can read about them there. At this point, I'm going to introduce David Stinson, who's a longtime board member of Shared Path, a registered professional planner who has worked with many Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations and municipalities, and he's a partner at Insight Planning. I'm going to ask him to turn on his video and his mic, and I'm going to ask the panelists also to turn on your videos and your mics. And David, let's maybe we won't go through those whole introductions. We can just kind of dive right into the questions. Thank you, everyone.
That's quite all right. Now, looks like you're controlling my camera, Morgan, but anyway, let's see. All right, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, I thought maybe in terms of questions, I'd like to start perhaps with Ted. Are you there, Ted?
Yes, I am, David.
How you doing?
We're good.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you recall the first meeting that you attended and what it was like and what was actually discussed at that first meeting.
Thank you very much. I do recall the meeting over at Mooster Point and Miigwech to Mooster Point, and former Chief Baron King and Colette in coordinating that. And I want to say kudos to Chairman Klink as well for the organization. I recall going to the meeting. I was on council at the time. I wasn't chief, and I was assigned by my chief to attend this on his behalf. And it was, I can, part of what I can say is that, you know, the immediacy was to develop an agenda and move things forward. And I recall saying something to the effect that, well, in order for us to begin working together, we need to know who each other are, understand where we all come from, and you know, develop relationships before we actually can do any kind of work. And so the meeting went along okay, but it was the meeting subsequent that I recall that that actually stand out for me.
Thank you. Maybe I'll ask Colette, if you're there, what was your impression about the first meeting? And I'm curious whether or not, and maybe Ted can chime in on this too, whether or not there was a long-term plan or a medium-term plan sketched out in these early meetings.
Thanks, David. So at the time when the meeting started, I was the senior administrator at Moose Deer Point First Nation. And I was very excited. I had just started that job, and I was very excited to get the letter that talked about, wouldn't it be great if we sort of built some bridges, because we don't have bridges. It can be very, First Nation has very different priorities and responsibilities and jurisdictions than their local neighbors. And so sometimes the work that we do doesn't seem relevant to the work that is getting done. So the first meeting was held in Moose Deer Point, and I didn't know what to expect. It was a huge turnout. I was very excited about that. We had all kinds of mayors and the chair, and some senior people, and our neighboring First Nations were there. So that was exciting, but it was also, in some ways, it was also unique for Moose Deer Point to have all these people in our community. The conversations, I think I would agree with Chief Williams, the conversations seemed to be trying to push ahead too quickly, and I did respect Ted's comments that maybe we need to slow down a bit and build these relationships, but there was a lot of goodwill there. That's what I remember, a lot of goodwill to keep going.
Yes, if I can chime in there, David, just to
Yeah, please.
You know, one of the first things that we started to work on was a land acknowledgement statement. And in order to develop a land acknowledgement, it's not my job. It's not Colette's job. It's not the First Nations job. It's the non-Indigenous community. It's your job. But in order for you to do that job, you need to understand where we come from, the trials, the tribulations, the challenges, the obstacles, the history, all of that. And so we had a pretty intense discussion. I believe it was in Bracebridge. And now picture this, and I'm a fairly big, imposing figure. And if I get into a room with other individuals and you know, you get this feeling that, we want to make sure that we say the right thing, because we don't want to tick that big guy off over there. You know, and that was where I was coming from, and I knew that we had to get past that. And so we actually, I said, I'll give you 3 strikes, you know, and you can say something that I may not agree with, or you may be offside, and I'll give you the pass, and then I'll give you the pass again. But on the 3rd one, you know, you might get it. But this is as hard as you're going to get it. And so we had a really good session at that time, and I'm going to say that, we developed a greater understanding of each other's roles. We shared the history of the region. We collaborated on projects. We tapped into the experiences and knowledge of our new associates. We developed different kinds of partnerships. We've witnessed positive outcomes. I want to share this. One of the positive outcomes, and it just happened yesterday. Mayor Kelly from Gravenhurst, his son is the executive director for the Golf Association of Ontario. And as a result of developing these relationships, the Golf Association of Ontario called me, and they have now instituted an Ontario Indigenous golf tournament sanctioned by the Golf Association of Ontario. And it's going to be happening in September. And this is what has happened as a result of, the development of these relationships. And I have to say, because I know time is moving on, and I want to say this, that what we have discovered and what we have, I guess, developed is some very strong, true, sincere friendships with our friends up in the District of Muskoka. And I personally couldn't be prouder of our association with all of our new friends for a few years now up at the District of Muskoka. It's been just fabulous. Miigwech.
Thanks, Ted. I really appreciate it. That's a great story. It's very encouraging. I won't take time now. I know that Moose Point, in some of their early work, say 20 years ago, was facilitated because the mayor of the neighboring municipality and the chief had met on the golf course and knew each other as golfing partners. So it's a very fascinating to hear you say that, Ted. I'm very pleased to hear that. Yeah, I'd like to ask a question of our mayors that are present. Peter and Terry, in the course of building these relationships, it's my understanding that you undertook several sort of cultural training exercises, something called the blanket exercise. I believe you had in Kelly Brown Bill to give a sort of some cultural context. And I'm very curious about what you feel you learned from that process. And then a second question might be what you think your fellow colleagues learned from it. But I'd like to hear your experience specifically.
I don't know who you'd like to go first. Shall I take a
Terry, please. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, well, I got to say, discussing the blanket exercise, I showed up with, I don't even know, there was quite a great deal of us there. I would guess that I'm going to take a shot at 30 or 40, or I don't know how many people were there. And we were in a giant circle, and we were at a wata, it was phenomenally moving for me. I remember crying. I remember I was unable to speak. I was so moved by it, and I got to say that I think that was a shared response. I know as Chief Williams had put out, I was extremely nervous. I'm thrilled to hear he was nervous because he didn't look nervous, but I got to say I was extremely nervous. I wanted to be so careful because I didn't want to, disrespect anyone. But I really don't know anything. I didn't know what I was talking about. But I got to say that was an incredibly moving experience, incredibly educational. Opened up my eyes, and of course I went home and shared it with my family. And since then, there's been all kinds of education experiences. We've had Kelly Brumbill here to the Township offices. We had a ceremony here, and we've had our own educational teaching. So it was fantastic. I'll let Peter talk for a bit. As politicians, we'll take the whole show now. So here you go.
Well, it'll be hard to compete with Chief Ted, though, I think. But having said that, no, I was extremely impressed with the blanket exercise. I mean, it wasn't so much the content, but the method that I think was so effective, because a lot of the information they shared I'd already read somewhere, and it kind of made sense and all that. But for the blanket exercise, you were actually feeling it. You were in a sense witnessing it. When they started moving people around, and the numbers became a little more real. And I thought it was an exceptionally effective, almost efficient way of getting a lot of lessons across. And so a great introduction for many people. And I think that's, for me, and I know I'm not alone on this, is that one of the real benefits of this group and what we've been doing the last 3 years, it has been the education. And not just the I'll call it the more formal education, whether it be the blanket exercise or having various people go through the history, but sitting beside Ted and Ted saying, this is going to take some time. We're not rushing this. We're going to know each other first. We're going to learn about each other, share a little bit of our personal histories, talk it through. I do remember once he's saying, well, it took us hundreds of years to dig this hole. We can't expect to get out of it in a couple of months. And I think, to me, the patience that we had from the Indigenous individuals around the table was very meaningful and helpful.
Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate that. Thank you for sharing your experience. This is, I think, the most important part of this is that we get to reflect on these things personally. On that very same note, Colette, if I could ask you, recently you've gone through a process with the municipality in having them include your water treatment plant in the source water protection plan. And I believe you made the statement that this was reconciliation in action. And I was just wondering if you could maybe reflect on that a little bit and the depth of that for Moose Deer Point.
Oh, absolutely, David. This was one of the one of the most important outcomes of this relationship building exercise. There have been a couple, but this one represented environmental protection, as did the moving of the bins, the solid waste plan work, it's the same sort of thing. But this one in particular was so striking to me because it was just an offhand remark I made at the duty to consult working table. I did not expect anything to come of it. In 2020, at the end of 2020, Moose Deer was doing some upgrading to its water treatment plant. We were having problems with our intake, and that's when I started looking around to see what kind of source water protection that we actually had. I found out there was a ginormous loophole there. Nobody knew about our source water intake for our water treatment plant. Nobody, not at the province, not at the federal level. And those who did know it was like they knew, they filed it away and never to be thought of again. So I just casually mentioned this at the table, and within not very much longer, the district planner came to me, sent me an email and said, listen, we might be able to help you here. And went ahead and made an official plan amendment, worked with us to figure out where the intake actually was in 12 Mile Bay, and then went ahead almost entirely on their own, but they consulted with us. But we weren't involved in actually doing the work that was required. They simply responded to our need and, put a zone around our intake, 1 kilometer intake zone that would help protect our intake and our water for the future. And that was successfully passed at council. Not exactly sure what the municipal process is, but anyway, towards the end of November of the past year, so in less than a year from me originally mentioning it to having it recognized in the official plan of the District of Muskoka, we had source water protection. almost without the First Nation. I didn't even realize that this could happen, and the response from the district made me suggest that this was reconciliation in action. This was actually trying to resolve the issues where First Nations are seen as this big black hole in municipalities without recognition of our rights or our responsibilities to be there.
Thank you. They're very heartfelt. I really appreciate that. Morgan, if you're there, I'm just trying to be mindful of the time. I do have more questions, and I'm quite willing to keep going here, but just where are we at in the process?
Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I would encourage you to go ahead with the questions prepared, and Tina's doing a great job of answering some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A.
Oh, good.
Yeah, which is great. So why don't we continue with what you've prepared, and please, if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to get to it. We might not, but if not, maybe we can answer it at a later time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Morgan. I'd like to ask the mayors again, Terry and Peter, what surprised you in this process, or you know, and maybe beyond that, you know, what do you think that you have learned in this process to date?
Well, I'll go first again, if that's okay, Peter. I've got to say, I have to mention that it was said off camera before we started, but Chief Williams and Tina were really, really important to this process, and especially Chief Williams, because he spoke to me a couple of times off panel during coffee, and it had a huge effect. And I think the calmness, the way he explained things. I mean, I was looking for guidance. I was looking for ways to deal with things, and he would basically put it back in my plate and say, you know, you're going to have to figure it out on your own. And then later I realized the wisdom in that. But one of the biggest surprises, if I could answer the question, for me was that I learned that, as Tina had pointed out in her earlier presentation, we think we have a completely different approach to problem solving, and I have grown in appreciation of that, and realized that that is probably the key message. That if I was going to bring a message today, that because we both have completely different approaches to the way we deal with things, we need to be patient, we need to discuss it, we need to communicate, and we need the calm, collective wisdom of everyone to explain, and not to be as concerned that you're going to offend, because I'm just trying to learn. This is all about growth. This is all about all of us growing together and learning. And now that we're aware of it, we will continue to grow. But I think it was that there's a completely different method by which we tackle problems. And I actually prefer Chief Williams' method, but I'm in the district and I'm doing my best there as well.
Yeah, what surprised me, well, I guess in one sense it all surprised me, because I had no idea what I was walking into in that first meeting, as you've heard already. And I unfortunately had to show up a little late because I had another scheduled meeting, and I came in late, and I was impressed by the conversation. But I think what has surprised me is the more I learn about the Indigenous history and the history of the Indigenous, I'll say, versus the settlers. There are times the angrier and angrier I get, because it's a lot worse than I originally thought. And then, so what really surprises me is the patience, the support, the time that the Indigenous members of our leadership table have given us, both at the table and outside of the table. The willingness to work with us, to me, is amazing, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thanks, Peter. I really appreciate that. There's another question I think I'd like to direct this to Ted. It's very specific in some ways, Ted, about about your role. You are now the elected chief of Rama, and you're sitting as sort of equals with the mayors. But you're also, Rama is also the underlying treaty holder for much of Muskoka. Muskoka is actually named after one of the early leaders of your community, Chief Muskweki. Forgive me if I'm getting the pronunciation just a little wrong there. This is your traditional territory. And in that sense, Rama has jurisdiction that's much like the province or even like the federal government. Is that jurisdiction, has the leadership table been a good place to explore that jurisdiction?
I will say that there's a huge amount of respect. Once you explain, the traditional territory of the Chippewas of Rama, Muskoka, named after Chief Yellowhead Meskwaki, and we're part of the Williams Treaty First Nations, which encompasses that territory as well as the Chippewa Tri-Council, Beausoleil, and Georgian Island, and so we acknowledge and honor them as well. One of the things that I think is important for me is, and it's come through experiences, and no one makes it alone. Rama doesn't make it alone. Gravenhurst, Bracebridge, Lake of Bays, Huntsville, they don't make it alone. I do know this, that the importance of relationships is key. Any success that you're going to have in life, whether you're a politician, whether it's at home, whether it's in sports and or any other social activity, 85% of that success is going to be dependent on the relationships that you develop and how well you get along with people and how intellectually you are intelligent. The ability to get along with anyone at any time on any subject is very, very important. And you have to carry yourself well. And my role is to open up doors of opportunity for my brothers and sisters in the Indigenous community. If I come across as being something less than, unfortunately, I may close the door for my brother and or my sister. And I don't want that to happen. It's a huge responsibility. And that's just not the way I feel leadership needs to carry themselves. And so this whole exercise and involvement with the Muskoka Area Indigenous Leadership Table has been very rewarding. And I had said it many times before, at least several, that the stuff that we've got going on here is the envy of other municipalities and the Indigenous communities across the country. We've got something very special happening here. And for that, I'm very, very proud of our Indigenous community and our good friends within the municipalities of Georgian Bay District.
Thanks, Ed. That was quite lovely. I really liked how you brought that together. I think many people don't realize that Ontario is one of the Canadian jurisdictions that is completely covered in treaties. There are other parts of the countries where that's not quite the case. But that means is that we are in relationship. Sometimes the larger society has forgotten that. But the whole point of treaties is that we have a relationship. And I'm very pleased to see that this is starting to work its way into the municipal processes and procedures of Muskoka. Morgan, I don't know if we've got enough time. There were some questions that got sent in from some of our participants. I can briefly maybe address this, and if anybody wants to chime in.
Well, why don't David actually? So Chief Ted Williams has to leave. Miigwech for your time. I think we've answered some of those questions during the conversation, but Tina has also kindly offered to for people to email her with additional questions. So maybe we should just ask the panelists for some closing thoughts.
Indeed. Yeah, well, why don't we start with Colette?
I just want to say I agreed with everything Chief Williams had to say. This has been a remarkable undertaking, and I too am very proud of the work that we've taken on, the way that it has happened and the organic nature of it. It's been a pleasure, and I think that without the coordinating body and the effort at the district, it would never have happened this way.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Peter this time. Let's just do the reverse order. Peter.
Well, thank you. I guess, as I said before, I'm very grateful for all the opportunity that the last 3 years have brought for education, to learning more and more. And I think more importantly, I'm very much looking forward to continuing and strengthening the relationships, getting to know each other better, and doing more and more things together. There are a number of projects that we can keep working on together to serve all of us, and that I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Excellent. Terry, please.
I want to say thank you to the whole group. I was deeply honored to be part of this, and I greatly look forward to many more meetings. And I think that if nothing else we can take away from this pandemic time, this time we've all been through, is we may have to learn to think a different way. We may have to deal with things differently. We may have to be way more innovative as the emergencies continue to come. And I think that we can only grow and learn from our Indigenous friends with regards to even the way we approach problems. And so, again, I want to thank everybody, and I sure appreciate it. And thanks for allowing me to join today.
Thank you. Maybe Tina, do you have any a last thought, Tina?
My last thought is just to, if anybody's on this webinar and listening and they're hesitant, don't be too afraid. 4 years ago, I barely knew where Wata, Moose Deer Point were. Like, I had been there, but I didn't have any connections. Just have the faith, and you'll be rewarded, I think. So that's it.
Great. Thank you, everyone, so much for that excellent conversation. Thank you, David, for moderating. I know people have to go, so yes, Chimwich, thank you very much, and hope we all stay in touch.
Thank you all.
Miigwech.
Which